Thank you very much for inviting me here today. My name is Richard Butler. I'm an engineering manager, work for GMUTC, which is the Traffic Signals Department for Transport for Greater Manchester. I'm here to talk about protected junctions in the UK context, which is somewhat different to the rest of the world. There's been a big political pressure, impetus over the last few years to improve cycle safety because we really need to get more people cycling. Back in 2014, we only had about 2% of cyclists in Greater Manchester using that as their preferred way of getting to work, so we really need to do something about it. What this image shows here is something we've called the Cycle Optimised Protected Signals, or Cyclops, and it shows that they do look relatively complex, but essentially we're putting the cyclists always around the outside of the junction, which means we can retain the flexibility to have trams, all modes of transport dealt with, pedestrians with the sort of walk with traffic elements, staggered islands, triangular islands, etc. A bit of history. From before 2010, we had very limited options in the UK. On the left-hand side, we've just got the advanced stop lines, which put the cyclists just out in front of the traffic and gave them a limited head start in front of the traffic. So it really just increased the conspicuity, but didn't massively improve the situation for cyclists. On the right-hand side, we have a toucan crossing, which is where the cyclists and pedestrians share the same space. And it's a really easy option for traffic signal engineers because we can just deal with it like a normal pedestrian crossing, but it's wider, and the cyclists and pedestrians share the same space. But they don't really like that because they prefer to be separated, and vulnerable users have a real issue with cyclists sharing the same area. Moving on from that, we looked at various options that London had been using in the past. The cycle gate is the facility shown on the left-hand side, and what we do is separate the cyclists from the traffic on the approach to the junction. The cyclists then enter a reservoir, and they can be released when both the traffic phases get to green. So we separate them in time and space. Now, the problem with that is it requires a lot of infrastructure and takes significant capacity away from the junction. On the right-hand side, we have the early release, which is a similar scenario where we give the cyclist an early start, which is good if you arrive when the signals are on red, because it gives the cyclist a 5-second early start to get past the conflict point. But if the cyclists arrive in the main traffic green, it's no good at all, unfortunately, and the conflict isn't resolved. The cycle stage here is good if you've got a two-way cycle track to go straight through the junction, but we don't need to deal with any turning movements. So it's ultimately very safe, but infrastructure-wise, it takes a lot of, you'd never be able to do it for sort of more than one route across the junction, so it's not really applicable for multiple movements and where the cyclists need to turn. This is a hold the left. We've discussed these. I think it's been raised in a couple of the presentations so far. Essentially what's happening here is that the main road traffic gets a green and the parallel cycle phase can also run at the same time. This is very infrastructure heavy because it needs islands to separate the left turn and the right turn, which are held from the cyclists. And also if you want to do it in a two-way, such that the side road also had this facility, it would require an awful lot of space and again is quite capacity limiting. So we assessed all of these current strategies and we wanted to see whether any of them were particularly good, and you can see on the table that no single protection element is scoring particularly highly. So an early release is poor in terms of resolving conflict and capacity, but it's better in terms of delay and spatial efficiency, whereas the hold the left with the two-stage right turn doesn't score green apart from with capacity, but is not so good in terms of spatial efficiency, delay, etc. So we looked around the rest of the world, and the obvious place to start was in the Netherlands. Now, we have a big problem in the UK in that it's different from the rest of the world. We can't run a green pedestrian facility at the same time that a parallel traffic phase is running. So in most of the world, you could essentially, in two stages, get protected junctions by allowing for the fact that traffic is allowed to turn left or right off the road that's been given green and then has to give way to a green signalled pedestrian or cycle phase. We can't do that in the UK, it's not within our traffic law, so we had to come up with a different solution. So Dutch and Danish designs don't easily convert into the UK context. This is from the London Cycle Design Standards. It looks a lot like the protected junction concepts that we've seen so far today. We tried to develop something like this in Manchester, but we could see there were a number of problems with it, not least the fact that there's zebra crossings that cross onto an island and then change into a signal control crossing, which would be a little bit confusing, we think, for the disabled and vulnerable groups. Also, the pedestrian crossings were further from the desire line, so we looked for something slightly different. In London, they have produced the first fully protected junction in the UK. Slightly different to European examples, but in essence fairly similar because the cyclists are on the inside, as you can see here. This doesn't enable us to do more complex junction geometry internally, so we shied away from that a little in Manchester. We've produced a document called Cyclops Creating Protected Junctions. The link for that will be shown at the end of this presentation, but this is an excerpt from it. And basically, it's just detailing some of the golden rules that we have tried to produce in order to create a concept going forward. So, for example, number 2 there, I've shown that cyclists should be treated as an entirely separate mode from vehicular traffic. So we want to keep them entirely separate, as we're seeing from some of our European colleagues. Cycle traffic conflicts will typically require signal control. And just underneath that, we've said cycle and pedestrian interaction should be simple as possible. So it was decided going forward that where cyclists and pedestrians interact, it's better if it's on a one-way element. So, for example, on a roundabout, we haven't got two-way cycles because then the pedestrians only have to look in one direction. I won't go through all these in detail. You can have a look at the document at the end. This image here shows the monitoring that was undertaken after the Wilmslow Road cycleway. So we put in a scheme a few years back which did actually encourage quite a lot of cyclists, but we then since reviewed it to look at whether the facilities were good enough, and you really have to take on board the comments from the visually impaired groups and people who have trouble with mobility. So we've got to make sure that islands are distinct and navigable, and you also remember that cyclists are silent, so visually impaired groups can't obviously hear the cyclists coming, so it's got to be very obvious where the actual crossings are. This led us to our first concept in Greater Manchester, and it's called the Cyclops on Royce Road. So the key features here are an external cycle track that goes all the way around the outside. Now notice that's different from what we've seen so far today. The signal control pedestrian facilities are across the carriageway in the middle of the junction. We can have zebra or informal crossings of the cycle track on the outside. And cyclists actually have the ability to stay on the main road or filter back onto the main road and go through when they get their traffic green, or they can use the new facilities and go around the roundabout. Now, this junction design is essentially different from the rest of the world because we cannot rely on giving a green on the main road and then hoping that traffic will give way to cyclists and pedestrians. So that can't be done in the UK. And in this scenario, there's a dedicated stage in which all the pedestrian and the cycle facilities run at the same time, with all the traffic phases held. This is a visualization of that very junction, and we're happy that we've got the spatial fit right here. If you look at the islands, it's fairly obvious where the pedestrians need to be. We think they're amply sized, and the crossings of the cycle track should be fairly comfortable. And because it's a gyratory for cyclists, we believe that pedestrians should understand that the cyclists are always going to be coming from the right-hand side. So the benefits of an orbital cycle system, in general putting cyclists around the outside, is that we can signalise all traffic cycle conflicts very simply. Cycle phases can run simultaneously, especially when there's an all-red stage. Cycle conflicts need not be signalised, and it's possible to make two-phase right turns. So if you're turning right, which is the equivalent of your left over here, this can be done simultaneously if we run the stage for long enough. Cycle and pedestrian phases can run simultaneously, as I've said, and importantly, if it's a gyratory, multiple origins and destinations can be dealt with. So you could have a four-arm junction where there's actually more than 4 cycle origins and destinations. So you could have potentially 6 or 7. And if it's a roundabout gyratory, it's easy to deal with multiple origins and destinations. Now, the benefits of externally putting the cyclist around the outside rather than internally, the real big one is you've got a larger orbit radius, and that means you've got more room for cyclists to store at the individual cycle stop lines, and you've got a longer turning radii. So you haven't got a very tight turning radius when you come off the gyratory, so you can have a 4 metre, say, internal radius minimum. Cyclists can filter on and off the orbital route without signal control. Pedestrian phases are shorter because you're only crossing the junction in the middle, and they're on the desire line, so we haven't had to displace them further away from the junction. There's a potential for diagonal cycle crossings as well in this scenario if you have the cyclist around the outside. And as I've also mentioned, there's a potential for complex signal staging, so you could have a relatively high capacity junction with triangular islands, staggered islands, various interesting signal phasing, which is all contained within the ring of the cycle phases. This is the image from the front of the brochure for this symposium. And just to discuss the detail in terms of staging, again, it's different from most of the rest of the world. What we would do here is traffic north and south in one stage, fairly straightforward. Traffic east and west in the next stage. And then pedestrians and cycle facilities all running at the same time. Now, this junction in Manchester hasn't been built yet, but the existing one already has a pedestrian stage, so we're not actually reducing the capacity by putting these cycle facilities in. So it already runs as a 3-stage junction. We're just adding the new cycle phases around the outside of it. So back to the table of comparisons with the previous measures that we've assessed in the UK, you can see that the Cyclops scenario on the end is very good at resolving conflict, is good for capacity, at least in the UK context. In terms of delay, it's good to moderate depending on how much green time you give for the cycle ped stage. And spatial efficiency-wise, we think this is the best way of achieving multiple cycle movements, all of them in fact, and pedestrian phases and whatever else within a limited footprint. This is the image that we've seen before. Johan was quite impressed with the complexity of it. But hopefully you can understand now why we put the cyclists around the outside. We're not able to have traffic giving way to peds and cyclists. So in this scenario, cyclists around the outside gives way to a diagonal crossing potential in the middle of this busy district centre in Chorlton in Manchester. This is one with a complex internal layout, as I mentioned. You've got a triangular island that can be seen. There's a staggered island. The 2 side roads are actually skewed relative to each other, and that means that the cycle orbital track that goes around the outside is skewed and isn't quite as round as it was previously, but again, it's visually similar to all the other ones. We hope it's going to be transferable and people will start understanding it if we use these more and more in Greater Manchester. Finally, one other example. Again, you can see the familiar cycle lane around the outside with a heavy left turn on this one, which is just shown on the top right-hand side of the image. So this has a cyclops around most of the junction, but a left turn has been appended onto it, and there's a triangular island which is big enough to deal with the interaction of the cyclists on the circulatory crossing the left turn slip itself. So a slightly different version there. The more info at the web address there if you want to see our document on Cyclops and the reason we've developed that. Has anybody got any questions? I'll have to get my headset so that I can understand them though first.